They said the ranch was cursed. They said the land had been picked clean, that even the vultures circled elsewhere. Elias Hart heard them laugh when he signed the papers at the county office. Men with boots polished by sitting more than walking chuckled into their coffee cups, muttering that the fool farmer had bought nothing but a stretch of sand and bones. The woman behind the counter whispered to her colleague that Elias might not last a season out there. Still, with a shaky hand and a prayer spoken under his breath, Elias put his name on the deed. The pen scratched across the page like it was carving a wound into his future. That night, when the cicadas screamed their endless hymn and coyotes painted the dark with shrill cries, Elias stood alone in the yard of his newly purchased ranch. The moon hung pale and swollen over the broken windmill, its blades creaking in the hot night air. The porch groaned under his boots, each step complaining like it remembered better times. The entire place seemed alive, not thriving but breathing slow, ragged breaths, as though the land itself had lungs full of dust. He would have blamed nerves, exhaustion, or hunger, if not for the sound that came next. A sharp metallic ringing, not from the windmill, not from the porch boards, it came from the ground. It was a hollow echo, faint but deliberate. Like a hammer striking steel deep beneath the earth, it shivered up through his boots, climbed his spine, and made his teeth hum. He froze, every sense stretching wide, listening to the night. Beside him, Scout, the only loyal companion left to him, jerked his head up, ears pointed like arrows. The dog growled low, then tugged against the rope, dragging Elias off the porch and toward the well at the center of the yard. The well was nothing more than a circle of leaning stones, half swallowed by weeds, its mouth black as the bottom of a coffin. Everyone had told him it was dry, useless, nothing but a hole that drank hope. But when Elias leaned over, the darkness seemed deeper than any he'd known. He dropped a pebble, counted, waited, no echo, no splash. The silence was worse than noise, like the well refused to admit its own emptiness. Then the metallic ringing rose again, clearer this time. Scout whined, his paws clawing the dirt near the well's edge. Elias's heart pounded against his ribs, each beat hammering the question, what lies down there? A gust of hot wind rattled the tin sheet on the barn roof. The smell of iron and oil, old, stale, out of place in the summer heat, drifted to his nose. Elias coughed, blinking against the sudden sting in the air. And then, as if in answer, the broken windmill creaked to life. Its blades turned once, twice, no wind pushed them. They moved like unseen hands had nudged them from below. The ranch was not empty. The ranch was not dead. Something lived here, and it wanted to be heard. The morning after Elias first heard the strange ringing, the sun rose heavy and merciless over the land. Dawn in that part of the county didn't arrive soft and golden like the postcards promised. It came harsh and sharp, a blade of light cutting across the horizon, heating the earth before a man could even drink his coffee. The air shimmered before noon, making the distant fence posts wobble like drunks on parade. Elias pushed his battered hat lower on his forehead and carried a dented bucket toward the trough, hoping for water that wasn't there. The ranch didn't care about hope. It demanded sweat. The soil was dry enough to crack under his boots. The grass was brittle, nothing but straw pretending to be alive. When he passed the chicken coop, 5 half-starved hens clucked nervously, their eyes bright with suspicion. He scattered a handful of feed, almost the last of it, and watched them peck at the ground with desperate energy. Scout, faithful and alert, circled the coop, his tail stiff, his nose twitching as though he still remembered the sound from last night. Elias sighed and turned toward the barn. The great sliding doors resisted like they hadn't been opened in years. With a grunt and a curse swallowed by the heat, he shoved them wide, sending a storm of dust spiraling into the air. The smell of mice, hay, and rust struck him at once. The rafters above were coated with cobwebs, heavy and grey, drooping like tattered flags from a forgotten war. He stepped inside, every bootfall echoing too loud in the hollow space. What greeted him wasn't the promise of prosperity, but absence. Empty racks where saddles should have been, bins with nothing but husks of grain. Hooks stripped bare, tools long gone. Yet in the far corner of the barn, something caught his attention, a length of capped iron pipe, leaning against the wall. It was thick, old, pitted with rust, but when he laid a hand on it, he froze. It was cool. Everything else in that barn was hot enough to burn, but the pipe was cold, as though it had been hiding in the shadow of another world. Elias pulled his hand back sharply, wiping it on his trousers, unsettled. He told himself it was nothing, just a trick of shade and metal, but in his chest, unease began to grow. He was a man used to unease. Life had taken almost everything from him. His wife and son had been buried 3 years ago after a winter sickness no doctor could stop. He carried their memory in a cracked photograph, edges curling, colors fading. At night, when silence pressed too close, he'd prop that picture on the rickety table, open his mother's old Bible and pray. Not elegant prayers, not rehearsed, just muttered words, half hope and half grief, whispered into the same silence that refused to echo the pebble in the well. The ranch had been all he could afford, a desperate gamble when the bank wouldn't loan him another dime, when work dried up like the soil itself. People in town thought him foolish. Maybe he was. But Elias had nothing left to lose, and sometimes nothing is the most dangerous weapon a man can carry. He walked the fence line as the sun climbed higher. Posts leaned, wire sagged, patches of barbed strands were broken or missing. Coyotes had already tested the weak points. He found their paw prints near the henhouse and swore under his breath. His hands itched for tools he didn't own, wood he couldn't afford, time he didn't have. At the far end of the property, beneath the crooked shadow of an old mesquite tree, he discovered something stranger still. Half buried under years of dust and weeds lay a square slab of concrete about the size of a door, laid flat. One corner showed a rusted iron ring, bolted deep. Elias knelt, ran his calloused hands across the surface, and brushed dirt away. The slab didn't belong. Not here, not in a ranch that was supposed to be nothing but dead soil and broken dreams. His chest tightened as the thought crept in. Somebody had tried to hide something. Scout padded close, sniffed the concrete, and gave a sharp whine. The dog laid his paw on the slab as if to mark it. Elias frowned and whispered, "Later." He stood, wiping grit from his palms, and walked back toward the house, forcing himself not to look over his shoulder. But even as he left, he felt the weight of the slab's silent secret pressing against his back. By midday, the heat had pressed every living thing into submission. Elias collapsed onto the porch, sipping at lukewarm water from a tin cup, staring out across the brittle pasture. He thought about the widow who had sold him the ranch for almost nothing. She had spoken softly, her eyes haunted, her words trembling like she wanted to say more, but couldn't. "There are sounds at night, Mr. Hart," she had warned. "Don't go looking where the dark insists." He had laughed then, nervously, thinking it was grief talking. But now, after last night's ringing, after the windmill had turned without wind, the memory of her voice unsettled him. What exactly had happened here? What had driven the family away so suddenly, leaving behind starving chickens, broken fences, and strange, cold metal pipes? The questions churned in his head until the sun finally began to sink. The horizon bled orange and red, the air cooling just enough to allow thought. He opened his Bible again that evening, tracing his mother's notes written in the margins. "Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find." His lips trembled as he whispered the verse. Somewhere in the distance, the windmill groaned as though mocking him, or perhaps agreeing. He was not a man to give up easily. Hardship had carved lines into his face, but it had also carved endurance into his soul. He had nothing but this land, this broken ranch, this mystery in the soil, and he would not walk away. Now, before I take you further into this story, before we step together into the shadows of the coop, the secrets under the well, and the truth that nearly cost Elias his life, let me pause and speak to you directly. If you've been carried this far, if you feel the dust in your throat and the weight of the mystery pressing on your shoulders, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Stories like this deserve to be shared, and I want you walking beside me every step of the way. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? A small town like Elias's, where everyone knows your name, or a big city where mysteries hide in different shadows. I read every message, and it brings me joy to know how far these tales travel. Now, back to Elias, and back to the ranch that held more than dust in its bones. The night was waiting, and the ringing would return. By the third day on the ranch, Elias had learned two things. First, the land was stubborn. Every fence, gate, and trough resisted his hands like it had sworn allegiance to abandonment. Second, the sounds in the night were no trick of exhaustion. They were real. That morning, the sky was pale as bone, and the heat had not yet risen to choke him. Elias worked along the east fence, hammering fresh nails into a rail that leaned like a drunk. Scout lay in the dirt nearby, panting softly, his ears twitching at every sound. For hours, all Elias heard was the strike of his hammer, the buzzing of flies, and the dry rustle of grass, until the tapping began. It was faint at first, so soft he thought it was just the hammer's echo bouncing off the coop. But then it came again, 3 sharp raps in rhythm, like knuckles on a table. He froze, sweat dripping from his brow, holding his hammer mid-air. The tapping continued. Not random. Not natural. A beat. Scout shot to his feet, growl low and steady, eyes fixed on the chicken coop. The hens inside fluttered, clucking uneasily, wings slapping straw. Elias felt the hair on his arms lift. He walked toward the coop slowly, each step heavy, his heart thudding loud enough he thought whatever was tapping could hear it. The coop's warped door scraped as he pulled it open. The smell of feathers, dust, and old cedar hit him hard. Shafts of sunlight pierced the cracks between the boards, slicing the air into strips of gold dust. Inside, the hens were restless, their eyes wide, their necks jerking like nervous dancers. The tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't above. It wasn't in the walls. It was beneath. Elias dropped to his knees and brushed aside the straw in the back corner. His fingers struck rough wood, the planks of the floor. Most were warped and loose, but one section felt deliberate, reinforced. He pressed his ear to it. The wood was cool, unnaturally so, and from beneath came the faint hum of something metallic, like machinery asleep but dreaming. His stomach turned. He clawed at the boards, prying until a splinter jabbed his thumb. The wood resisted, nailed tight, but eventually gave with a sharp crack. Beneath the plank was not soil, not stone, but tin. Corrugated tin hammered flat, forming a barrier that didn't belong under a chicken coop. Scout whined, nose pressed against the gap. The tapping ceased, replaced by silence so thick it seemed to ring in Elias's ears. He whispered, "What in God's name?" That was when he noticed the lock. At the far edge of the tin plate, a hasp and a padlock were bolted into place. The padlock was large, heavy, not rusted like everything else on the ranch. Someone had oiled it recently. Someone had been here. The truth wrapped around Elias's throat like a noose. This ranch wasn't abandoned. At least, not entirely. A crunch of gravel startled him upright. He stepped outside the coop, squinting against the midday glare. A cloud of dust rose along the dirt road, curling like smoke behind a truck. Red, loud, the kind of truck that wanted to be seen. It was Wade Tolland. The man owned half the county in one way or another. His cattle roamed far past his fences, his money bought friends at the courthouse, and his reputation bought fear everywhere else. He parked crooked near the gate, dust swirling around him, then stepped out in boots too clean and a hat too white. "Morning, Hart," he called, smiling wide, but his eyes scanned the coop, the barn, the well. Always the well. Elias wiped his palms on his trousers. "Tolland. Funny thing you buy in this place," Wade said, strolling closer. His spurs clinked like little threats. "Folks around here said it wasn't worth the dirt it sits on, but I always thought there was more to it. Memories run deep, you know, deeper than fences, deeper than deeds." Elias felt his stomach knot. He said nothing. Wade stopped near the coop, leaning one hand on the sagging fence. "My granddaddy used to run this land. Hollis, maybe you heard the name. He left things behind, important things, family things." He turned, his smile thin as a blade. "You seen anything? Something that doesn't quite belong?" Elias's jaw tightened. His throat felt dry as the dust around him. "No, just chickens." Wade chuckled, low and unpleasant. "Well, if you do, you let me know. Some debts don't show up on paper." He tipped his hat, turned, and climbed back into his truck. As he drove away, Elias swore the man's eyes lingered a second too long on the coupe. When the dust settled, the ranch was quiet again, but the silence was poisoned now. The tapping didn't return that afternoon, but Elias felt it in his bones as though the ground itself had a heartbeat. Scout stayed close, ears back, eyes darting toward the coupe as if he expected the boards to rise and walk away. That night, the storm came. It started with distant flashes of lightning, silent and ghostly across the horizon. Then the wind picked up, hot and restless, rattling the loose tin of the barn. Elias sat on his porch, Bible in hand, pretending to read but staring toward the coupe. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him until every breath felt borrowed. Then it began again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, sharper, like whatever lay beneath the coupe had decided hiding was no longer enough. The sound carried through the ground, vibrating the boards of the porch, rattling the windows. Scout barked once, then growled, pacing the yard like he was caught between fight and flight. Elias rose, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the dark outline of the coupe. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the land in a pale, merciless flash. For that brief second, he swore he saw the padlock glint under the planks, shining wet, as if freshly oiled. Thunder rolled, deep and endless, shaking the earth. The tapping stopped. But in the silence that followed, Elias could hear something worse. A hum, low and steady, rising from beneath the soil. It was the sound of a machine remembering itself. Elias whispered to the storm, "What have I bought?" Elias had not slept. The storm that night had churned overhead for hours, but even after the thunder rolled off toward the horizon, his mind would not rest. The tapping beneath the coupe had stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. Silence could be explained. Silence could be ignored. But this silence carried weight, as though it were waiting for him to make the next move. By dawn, Elias knew he could not wait any longer. He fetched his old bolt cutters from the barn, a tool so worn its red paint had faded to pink. His hands trembled as he carried them toward the coupe, Scout at his side, tail stiff as a rod. The hens fluttered nervously as he pushed open the warped door. Shafts of morning sun cut across the boards, illuminating the corner where the tin plate lay hidden under straw. The padlock gleamed darkly, untouched by rust, as though someone had been caring for it while everything else on the ranch rotted. Elias set the cutters on the shackle, his heart hammering louder than the hinges. For a moment he froze, haunted by the widow's words. "Don't go looking where the dark insists." But Elias was a man with nothing left to lose. The lock snapped with a metallic crack. The sound echoed through the coupe like a shot. He swallowed hard, pulled the hasp free, and lifted the tin hatch. Beneath, a shaft descended into the earth. Concrete walls, narrow ladder rungs of rusted steel, bolted into the side. A breath of air rose from below, cool, damp, and carrying with it the smell of iron and oil. Elias aimed his flashlight down, the beam carving through the shadows. At the bottom, perhaps 20 feet, a small room waited. "Stay," he whispered to Scout. The dog whined but sat at the edge as Elias gripped the ladder. Each rung groaned under his weight, flakes of rust staining his hands. But it held. Slowly, carefully, he descended into the hidden chamber. The room was cramped, no more than 8 feet across. A workbench stood against one wall, cluttered with tools and papers. The beam of his flashlight fell across a leather-bound journal, its cover darkened with grease. Beside it sat a wooden box, divided into padded compartments. Some were empty, others held odd objects, brass fittings, glass tubes, coils of wire wrapped like snakes. Against the far wall crouched the strangest thing of all, a riveted steel cylinder, waist-high with pipes disappearing into the ceiling. A hand crank jutted from one side, and a brass gauge sat at the top, its needle frozen in place. Elias stepped closer, heart racing. The machine gave off no sound, no vibration, yet it seemed alive. Its surface was cool to the touch, just like the iron pipe in the barn. He traced the nameplate with his fingers. Hollis and Sons, Aquifer Engine, Model C Hollis. The name Wade Tolland had spoken. Elias opened the journal with trembling hands. The handwriting was neat but urgent, as though each word had been written under pressure. He flipped through pages filled with sketches of pipes and pumps, equations scribbled in margins, and notes written like confessions. August 14th, if the county knew what we pulled from the limestone shelf, they'd hang us or hire us. The engine doesn't pump, it persuades. The wells answer when it sings. September 2nd, the drought has broken others, but not us. Wade once more, says the land should bow. I told him it isn't ours to command. He doesn't listen. October 3rd, Wade brought men. I bolted the hatch and told Ruth to keep the chickens loud. If you're reading this, stranger, you've inherited my sin. Elias lowered the book, his breath unsteady. Water. That was the promise. This machine, whatever it was, could coax water from the depths, feed the land, make the dry soil bloom again. The land wasn't dead, it was sleeping. But if the machine was real, if it worked, then Wade Tolland's interest was no coincidence. A sound above made Elias snap the journal shut. Footsteps on the porch, gravel crunching outside. He killed the flashlight and froze in the dark, ears straining. Muffled voices drifted down the shaft, followed by the creak of the coupe door. Scout barked, sharp and angry. "Easy, boy," a voice drawled. Wade. Elias's pulse thundered in his ears. He tucked the journal under his shirt, shoved the wooden box back into the shadows, and climbed the ladder as quickly as he dared. His boots scraped the rungs, every sound magnified in the tense silence. At the top, he eased the hatch shut, just as Wade stepped fully into the coupe. "Morning, Hart," Wade said. His smile was gone now, replaced by something colder. Two men stood behind him in the doorway, broad-shouldered and silent. One carried a crowbar, the other bolt cutters. "You've been busy." Wade's eyes swept the floor, lingering on the disturbed straw. He tapped his boot on the planks, listening. His gaze shifted to Elias. "Find anything worth keeping?" Elias straightened, dust on his clothes, the journal pressing against his ribs. "Just chickens," he said, his voice low. Wade chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You know, my granddaddy built something down there, something the county wasn't ready for. That's why this ranch never stayed empty for long. People think it's worthless, but me, I know better. And so do you, don't you, Hart?" Elias met his stare, saying nothing. Wade stepped closer, his boots creaking on the boards. "Here's how this goes. You sell me this place. Today, I'll pay you fair, more than you'll ever make scratching at this dirt. You walk away and you live, or—" his eyes hardened. "You stay, and what's buried here becomes mine anyway. Only difference is how much pain comes first." Scout growled, lips curled back, teeth bared. The men behind Wade shifted uneasily, Elias's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to shout, to fight, but fear strangled the words in his throat. He could see it clear as daylight. Wade was serious. He would take the land, the machine, the water, everything. And Elias had nothing but faith, a dog and a secret journal pressed to his chest. That night, long after Wade and his men left with their threats hanging in the air like storm clouds, Elias returned to the hidden chamber. He lit a lantern, set the journal open on the bench, and studied the diagrams. His fingers traced the crank, the pipes, the fittings. The machine waited, patient, silent. When he finally turned the key that had been tucked inside the journal's back cover, the gauge needle twitched. A low hum filled the room, soft at first, then steady. The walls vibrated faintly. Elias felt it in his bones. The Aquifer engine was waking, and with it, so was the war for his land. The storm returned the very night Elias coaxed the Aquifer engine back to life. Lightning split the sky into jagged bones. Thunder rolled across the plain like the growl of some colossal beast, and rain began to needle the dust into mud. The land had not drunk water in so long that each drop hissed, steaming on hot stone before finally surrendering to the soil. Elias stood in the yard, soaked to the skin, his hand on the rope of the well. Scout circled his boots, barking into the night. Beneath their feet, the engine hummed, its song pulsing up through the earth. The windmill groaned, its blades turning not from the storm's wind, but from the hidden power rising beneath the ranch. The trough filled for the first time in years, water gurgling like laughter from the throat of the earth. But the miracle had no time to settle. Headlights cut across the rain, beams stabbing through the storm. Tires splashed into mud as Wade Tolland's red truck skidded to a stop at the gate. Doors slammed. Men spilled out, broad and heavy, their boots already black with muck. Wade stepped down last, hat pinned low against the rain, pistol gleaming at his hip. "Evening, Hart!" Wade shouted over the storm, his voice carrying like a sermon of menace. "Heard you've been tinkering with what don't belong to you." Elias gripped the crowbar in his right hand, the star-shaped key in his left. His heart thundered louder than the sky. He forced his voice steady. "This land's mine. The widow sold it clean. Paper says so." Wade smirked, stepping forward. "Paper don't matter when blood says otherwise. My family built that engine. My family fed this soil when heaven wouldn't. And now you think you can steal it? No, Hart. Tonight it comes home." He flicked his wrist and two of his men surged toward the coop, crowbars raised. Scout leapt, teeth flashing in a lightning bolt's glow. He hit one man square in the thigh, dragging him down into the mud. The man howled, thrashing, his crowbar slipping from his grip. Elias seized the moment. He swung his own crowbar, iron cracking against iron as he blocked the second man's strike. The clash rang out sharp and raw, nearly swallowed by thunder. Wade drew his pistol. The muzzle glinted in the rain, aimed straight at Elias's chest. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The storm paused, holding its breath. Elias stared down the barrel of death and thought of his wife's smile, his boy's laughter, the photograph waiting on the kitchen table. He felt the hum of the engine beneath his boots, steady, faithful, like a heartbeat, not his own. And he refused to move. "You'll have to kill me, Wade," he shouted, voice hoarse but unbroken, "because I won't hand it over." Wade's jaw clenched. His finger tightened, but before the shot came, the land itself answered. The aquifer engine surged. The ground trembled. The well spat a gush of water so sudden and strong it knocked Wade's men back, drenching them in muddy torrents. The windmill whirled madly, blades shrieking as though the storm itself had been yoked to the machine's will. Scout tore free from his foe, mud flying from his coat. Elias swung his crowbar again, catching the second man's arm and sending him sprawling into the trough that overflowed with rushing water. But Wade stood firm, pistol steady despite the chaos. He stepped closer, rain streaking his face, fury blazing in his eyes. "This ends now!" he roared. A new voice cut through the storm. "Put it down, Wade." Deputy Miles Wilcox stood at the gate, soaked to the bone, revolver raised with trembling hands. He looked smaller than ever against the violence of the storm, but his voice carried authority. "I had 3 calls you were headed here. Trespass, armed. It ends tonight." Wade's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "This ain't your fight, Miles. Step aside." The deputy shook his head, water dripping from his brim. "Law says different." His voice wavered, but his gun didn't. "Drop it." For a moment Elias thought Wade might shoot them both. His hand twitched, his rage boiling hotter than the lightning crashing overhead. But then the aquifer engine roared again, louder, deeper, a sound that came from the bones of the earth itself. The ground shook violently. The slab by the mesquite tree heaved upward, bolts screeching as a hidden hatch buckled against years of pressure. The sight broke something in Wade. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in hunger. He lunged toward the hatch, pistol forgotten, slipping and sliding in the mud. "It's mine!" he bellowed, scrambling, clawing at the rising slab. Elias dropped his crowbar and ran. His boots pounded against the wet earth, every muscle screaming as he collided with Wade. The 2 men fell into the mud, grappling, fists striking, grunts lost in the storm. Wade was heavier, fueled by rage, but Elias had something stronger, desperation. He thought of the journal's words, of Ruth Hollis hiding this secret, of the widow's haunted warning. He thought of the land finally drinking again. He thought of the chance, just the chance, that this place could live. Scout lunged into the fight, teeth snapping close to Wade's arm. Wade cursed, shoving the dog away. Elias seized the moment, driving his shoulder into Wade's chest, forcing him back against the edge of the well. Water surged at their feet, cold and relentless, churning like the voice of judgment. "Let it go, Wade!" Elias shouted, gripping his collar. Wade's eyes burned wild, spittle mixing with rain. "Never! It's mine! My blood built it!" Lightning split the sky, illuminating them both in stark, merciless light. In that flash, Elias saw Wade not as a man, but as a ghost, haunted, obsessed, chained to a legacy of greed. He felt pity, brief and sharp, before survival demanded action. Wade shoved him hard, nearly sending Elias over the rim of the well. His boots skidded on wet stone. For a heartbeat, he hung between life and death. Then Scout barked, fierce and urgent, and Elias found his footing. With a roar born of exhaustion and faith, he heaved Wade backward. The man staggered, arms flailing, slipped in the mud, and fell hard. His pistol clattered away, lost to the storm. The deputy rushed forward, seizing Wade's arm, wrenching it behind his back. "That's enough!" Miles shouted, voice breaking with effort. "By law of this county, Wade Tolland, you're under arrest." Wade cursed, struggled, but the storm itself seemed to pin him down. Rain hammered the earth. The aquifer engine's hum steadied, the gauge in its chamber below settling on the word prime. The land drank deep, satisfied at last. Elias stood trembling, crowbar slipping from his hand, chest heaving with exhaustion. Scout pressed against his leg, mud-caked and panting. The trough overflowed, streams of water cutting through the yard like veins. For the first time in years, the ranch was alive, and Elias Hart, poor farmer, widower, and fool in the eyes of the town, had stood his ground against the storm, against Wade, against despair itself, and won. By the time the storm drifted east, dawn had already begun painting the horizon in streaks of grey and silver. The yard, once cracked and lifeless, had become a country of puddles, each reflecting the sky as though it were newly born. Water trickled from the troughs, filled the ruts of the drive, and seeped into the soil that had waited too long for mercy. The ranch no longer smelled of dust and decay. It smelled of rain, iron, and beginnings. Elias stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, mud drying on his clothes. Scout slept at his feet, tail twitching in dreams of victory. The deputy's truck had carried Wade away in handcuffs, his curses fading into the distance. For once, the law had stood taller than fear. The county would judge him, and though Wade still held power, he no longer held the ranch. The land had chosen otherwise. In the quiet aftermath, Elias returned to the hidden chamber beneath the coop. He lit a lantern and placed the journal on the bench. Its pages fluttered as though the storm still echoed in the air. He traced the notes Ruth Hollis had written, warnings, calculations, prayers scribbled in margins. Beside the journal he set his mother's Bible. Together they formed a record. Faith and invention, scripture and science, two kinds of hope bound by ink. The aquifer engine hummed softly now, steady, no longer wild but purposeful. The gauge rested on the mark, labeled prime. Elias ran his hand along the cool metal, whispering as though the machine could hear, "You've done enough for one night. Rest now." The vibration under his palm felt like a heart, patient and strong. In the days that followed, the town began to stir with rumors. Word traveled faster than wagons. The fool farmer's ranch had water again. Neighbors came first with suspicion, then with curiosity, and finally with casseroles and spare hands for mending fences. The same men who once laughed at Elias at the feed store now shook his hand, their eyes searching his face for the secret. Some asked outright what he'd found. He never told them the whole truth. He only said, the land was never dead. It just needed faith to wake it. The ranch came alive in ways Elias hadn't dared dream. Chickens grew plump, their feathers glossy. Seedlings sprouted in rows where before there had been only dust. Elias planted cottonwoods along the fence line, young saplings that reached for the sky with stubborn determination. When the wind rustled through their leaves, it sounded like applause. Scout resumed his patrols, though now he carried himself like a guardian proud of what he protected. Even the church folk began to see Elias differently. At the next potluck, Pastor Miller asked him to speak. Elias, uncomfortable in front of so many eyes, held his hat in both hands and cleared his throat. He told them about hardship, about nights when silence was so heavy it pressed on his chest, about prayers whispered not because he expected answers, but because he couldn't stand the thought of not asking. He told them about courage, the kind that doesn't roar but simply refuses to step aside. Sometimes, he said, voice rough, God hides engines in the earth and strength in men too tired to think they still have any left. And when those things meet, miracles happen. The hall was quiet when he finished. Then someone clapped and another until the sound filled the room like rain on a tin roof. Elias lowered his head, humbled, grateful. In time, the courts ruled in his favor. Wade's claims were dismissed, his threats reduced to mutters in jail cells and courthouse steps. He would return someday, no doubt, but he no longer frightened Elias. The ranch was his, sealed by paper, protected by law, and blessed by something greater. One evening, when the sun sank low and painted the world in fire, Elias carried the framed photograph of his wife and son into the chamber. He set it on the bench beside the journal and Bible. For a long time, he simply stood there, the lantern casting warm light over faces he would never see again. His throat tightened, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his cheeks. "We made it," he whispered. "We finally made it." The machine hummed, steady as a hymn. Scout barked once from above, as though agreeing. Elias climbed back into the open air. He walked to the porch, sat on the steps, and watched as the cottonwoods swayed in the evening breeze. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a fool. He felt like a man who had stood against storm and greed, who had claimed a place not just on paper, but in spirit. The land had tested him, and somehow he had been enough. And if you've walked with Elias through this tale, if you've felt the rain return to dry earth, if you've tasted the dust give way to hope, don't stop here. There are more stories waiting, more mysteries buried in forgotten fields and abandoned homes. Click to watch the next video and subscribe so you never miss when the windmill groans its first turn again. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. A farm like Elias's. A city where storms sound different against glass and steel. I read everyone, and each voice reminds me that stories like water are meant to flow far. Thank you for being here. Faith, courage, loyalty. That's the water under every good story.